The entire mill area covered about 18 acres and employed 1,500 people. It had 80,000 spindles and 2,600 looms, producing about 38,000 yards of cotton cloth each week. Clerks working for the Manville mill had their picture taken outside the mill office. The number 1 mill can be seen on the right in this photo, taken when road crews blasted through the ledge to make a road up Cumberland Hill. This is a view up the new road from the mill. In 1874, the company built 4 rows of brick mill houses to be used as living quarters for their employees. They were known as the brick blocks. Russell Handy replaced Samuel Mann as the leading citizen and had great influence over the village. He was a stern yet just man who was greatly admired. No liquor was sold in the village, and all persons employed were expected to conform to the moralities of life. He was a member of the Emmanuel Episcopal Church in Manville.
Il était un soldat déluré, non pas de l'eau. Il était un soldat déluré, non pas de l'eau, qui dansait une Marie, le déluré, non pas de lyre, qui dansait une Marie.
The Manville Company continued to expand its operation. The company owned 1,000 acres of land, which provided enough space for agriculture, buildings, and the mill. The village was built on wide streets with beautiful elm and maple trees giving shade. A larger workforce was required, and French Canadians were encouraged to leave their farms in Quebec and settle in Manville to work in the mill.
The textile industry at its outset employed a lot of English and Irish laborers. However, as the mills grew larger and they were starting to employ like 5,000 people, there really weren't enough English and Irish workers, or operatives as they were called. So the mill owners would actually send envoys or people up to Quebec in Canada, and with promises of great wages and wonderful working and living conditions. And the agricultural economy of Quebec at that time was kind of depressed. So it wasn't very difficult for them to find a lot of people who wanted to start a new life. So it started with a trickle, and they established villages in French-Canadian language-dominated villages like Manville. And of course, as the years wore on, those few who first came down, of course, had to break the ice. But those who followed found that they were almost at home, in that they were in a totally ethnic and French-speaking area. And it was almost like living in Canada, except that they were surrounded by textile mills as opposed to farm land.
With the influx of this French-Canadian population came the need for a Catholic church. Construction began on the original St. James Parish in 1873. From 1873 to 1875, the area experienced a serious smallpox epidemic, and all the schools were ordered closed to prevent the disease from spreading. It was finally controlled with a vigorous system of examinations and vaccinations. The Manville Public School was remodeled in 1878. The St. James Church can be seen from the schoolyard. Before the church was built, the upstairs of the school was used by the Catholic clergy to celebrate Sunday Mass. This turn-of-the-century photograph shows a class in front of the Manville Public School. Aaron Mann, a descendant of Samuel Mann, sits in the front row. By 1880, thousands of French Canadians had come to work in the mills. Woonsocket, with 6,000 French Canadians, was the French capital of New England, and Manville was second. This mass emigration from Quebec occurred for a number of reasons. At that time, most of them lived on farms and were poor or in debt. Overpopulation, which created a deficit of available farmland, poor soil, a short growing season, and difficult access to markets, led to poverty. With poverty came despair and a desire for a better life. The mills in the United States needed workers. No formal skills or education were required, and there was work for women and children. Emigration was seen as a short-term solution to financial problems. It was difficult to leave family members behind. It was difficult to leave their agricultural way of life, their culture, and their religion. They would return when their finances improved. But for many farmers, industrial work improved their social status. They were introduced to electricity, running water, a steady paycheck, and even holidays. They sent for their families to join them in their new prosperity. Cousins, uncles, aunts, nieces, and nephews would soon join the immigration, creating a pattern of settlement with strong family ties. Many of the French-Canadian immigrants who arrived in Manville came from the Richelieu Valley in Quebec.
My great-grandfather, Abraham Leclerc, probably crossed the border back in the 1890s, early 1900s. My grandfather was born in Canada. My grandmother was born in Canada.
Well, my father was born in St. Simon in Canada, and he came to Manville when he was 3 or 4 years old. And the reason they came, I guess in those days, they had a better chance for a better living in the States than they did in Canada. My grandfather moved the whole family here.
Yeah, because of the mills, the work, and it, you know, they were French Canadians, and there was a lot of it there. A lot of people like that, and they just seemed to find friends here. Oh yeah, they used to write to each other and tell them what's going on, and they'd say, "Well, you think I should go down?" "Yeah, sure, come down. If you can't find a place, you can stay with us till you find a place, you know."
My father was born in Manville, and my mother was born in a part of Quebec they call Contrecoeur. It's the little village Contrecoeur, which is not very far from a very well-known place they call Sorel. And she came to Manville, I guess she was quite young.
Well, there was no money in Canada, so they got a job here in the mill, Manville Company.
The people from Quebec were coming over here because there was the textile industries around Manville, Pawtucket, and a lot of other places in Rhode Island had a lot of textile. Woonsocket was one of the places they had a lot, but Manville was known as one of the biggest mill in the area.
Hey, Manville, it was business in those days. 3,000 people employed in there. If you think that ain't a big mill.
While he was superintendent of the Manville Company, Russell Handy established a manufacturing business in New York, which was managed by his sons. His son Thomas developed the methods for producing double plush and secured the patents for this process. When his mills were destroyed by fire, he purchased 300 acres of land in Manville, known as the Lapham Place, and constructed a dam along Mussey Brook, which created Handy's Pond. He built a 2-story brick mill which manufactured cotton, jute, flax plushes, and velveteens by a process they held the patents on, and for some time they were the only manufacturers of this kind in the United States. It was called the Contrexeville Manufacturing Company, named after Contrexeville Springs, a health resort in France where he was sent to regain his health after an attack of appendicitis. Russell Handy died on November 22, 1887, a few months after his mill was put into operation. His memory was preserved in a beautiful poem. The Handy Mill employed about 150 people, a small company in comparison to the Manville Company, but still had economic importance to the area. When his father died, Edwin Handy became president of the company until his death in 1904. He ran the mill with his brother Thomas, who was secretary and treasurer. In later years, Edwin's son, Senator Russell H. Handy, served as president. Thomas remained as treasurer until he was into his 70s. For several generations, members of the Handy family lived in this mansion behind the mill. Over the years, the mill changed hands, and in 1950, it was known as the Lincoln Processing Company. Later, it was bought out by Rochambeau Wistard Mill, where they continued to manufacture textiles. The Manville Company continued to grow and became the cotton manufacturing giant of the region. It was now too large to have any type of personal relationship between workers and the company. The company was more concerned with consolidation and competition. It merged with the Social Manufacturing Company of Woonsocket and in 1907 bought out Burnham Mills in Georgiaville, Rhode Island. The company had a total of 310,000 spindles and 9,000 looms. The Manville Company was now one of the two largest cotton manufacturers in the state.
When you get halfway down Manville Mill Hill on the right-hand side, there was a huge white structure that was the superintendent of Manville Mill's house. He was supplied with a house. It was a beautiful house, and they had a little pathway where he could come out of his house and walk down. They made him a wooden pathway, and he could walk right down to the back and kind of land right in front of the mill. When Textron bought the Manville Mill and kind of closed it, it was kept as a community house. And then after that, it was sold to a brother's house. Some brothers from New Hampshire bought a religious group, and they called it was Ephata House. The word means Ephata, open. When the Lord touched the person's ears, he said open so the guy could hear. And they used to have religious seminars here Friday, Saturday, and Sunday.
The Primitive Methodist Church on Old Main Street was built in 1899. As time went on, the congregation dwindled, and the last services were held here in April 1962. The new Manville Library, located on Main Street, was completed in 1907. This was a one-story wood frame building covered with plaster to resemble sandstone. The exterior was later covered with clapboard. Today it is a private residence.
I think that one of the best ways to describe it, if you had been to the John Carter Library at Brown, you know, shelves from floor to ceiling, nice heavy wooden shelves, not metal like you'd see today. It was an architectural work of art inside with a skylight on the ceiling and varnished floors.
In 1909, the Manville Businessmen's Association was formed, and there was talk of breaking away from the town of Lincoln and becoming a city. There were 6,500 people in Manville then, and 90% were French Canadian. The original Manville Public School burned in 1910, and in 1912, a new two-story brick schoolhouse was built to replace it. This building was used up until the 1960s. It has since been turned into an apartment complex and still stands today.
Because most of the students in Manville were French-Canadian descent and went to the parochial school, the enrollment at the Manville Elementary and Junior High School was not that high. So we had a lot of room, a lot of elbow room. Consequently, in eight classrooms, there were 8 classrooms in the building, and there were 9 grades. Oh, I can remember a teacher teaching music with an old Ooh, I wish I had it now. An old Victrola, RCA Victrola with the hand crank and the trumpet coming out. And the first grade teacher had that, and we'd use that for music instruction. It's a long time ago.
Beginning around 1913, Italians started coming to Manville to work in the mill.
There was no work in Italy, and people just couldn't help survive. And most of the time, a lot of the families that came over from Italy at that time, whenever they raised money, they always sent money back to their family in Italy to help them survive. And most of the Italian section, which was the northern part of the village of Manville, all settled in that one spot, saying from Ascension Street down to almost the border of Woonsocket on Railroad Street. That was the Italian community. The central village in Manville at that time was noted as Le Petit Canada, or Little Canada, and it's still called the same thing. And the Polish people had a community which settled in the southern part of the village of Manville, which they used to call New Village, which all these houses were built by the old Manville Jenks people at that time.
In 1917, Manville received an award for the greatest improvement in appearance of a mill village. Before that, in 1912, the company had hired a local flower expert, Mrs. Linda Forster, to teach floral culture to the workers. This was to encourage people to create gardens between the tenements and thereby beautifying the village. Contests were held each year for the best gardens, and every family had their plot between the rows of mill houses. The original St. James Church was built in 1873 under the direction of Reverend James Fitzsimmons. To start the project, he bought an acre of land and obtained $4,500 worth of timber. It was a wooden church with a seating capacity of 800 and was named St. James after his patron saint. By 1888, a rectory had been built beside the church, the land having been donated by the Manville Company. Also, a parish school was completed and dedicated on September 20th, 1893. The convent was built in 1896 when Reverend Eugene Lassade was the pastor.
It was a very attractive wood frame church, extremely elaborately decorated inside. And all of a sudden, one night, it just burnt down in November of 1919.
Aldor Labine was born in 1902 and was 17 years old when the church burned.
Yeah, I was hunting. I was out in the field hunting when that burned. So we knew there was a fire, but we didn't know where. So coming back, we come down that street. There was the church, all burnt.
The Manville Fire Department was called out with their hand-drawn combination hook and ladder and hose wagon. But attempts to save the church failed, and the firemen concentrated their efforts on saving the other parish structures. By midnight, the flames had subsided, leaving behind a burning mass of wreckage. It is believed that the fire was caused by an electrical short circuit. During the 1920s, masses were held in the basement chapel of St. James. Reverend Eugene Lassade was the pastor, and his enthusiastic efforts to have a new church built brought in contributions from the parishioners.
I always remember saying my grandmother and all the ladies, when the church burned down, they would have teas and coffee hours and everything, digging up money when they built the new church.
When Father Lassade died in 1929, his beautiful church was still not completed. Father Damaris was appointed as pastor of St. James a few months later, and on April 17, 1932, a dedication ceremony was held. The new church was complete at a cost of $150,000.
So all through the Depression years, the sacrificial giving on the part of all these parishioners contributed to the magnificent building that we have now. It's a real testament of their faith, and it shows in what they've provided for future generations. I'm Father Richard DeZonia. I'm presently the pastor. I've been pastor here now for 9 years. This year, this parish is celebrating 130 years. There was a real need to establish this parish because of the Franco-American migration from Canada that took place in the heyday of the mills, especially Manville, Jenks. If you looked at the village from a bird's eye view, you would see that the church is right in the center of the village. And more or less, that's what St. James became. It became the center of the life of the entire village, especially when the Franco-Americans came to work the mills. The church provided all sorts of things, not only the spiritual well-being to the parishioners, but also the social center of their lives. The church had a bowling alley, they had a movie theater, they had dances, and all sorts of things that people go elsewhere now to the malls for. The church provided the whole social fabric of the village.
And so all the choirs of angels in heaven we proclaim your glory, and join in their rising, give us praise.
And the church was a big part of the community in the village of Manville.
And I always was working with the sisters. I loved the sisters, and I would go to convent and work with them on Saturday. Those days they used to make the host for the church, you know. And so we always wanted volunteers, and I was always one to volunteer to go.
St. John's Hall, a Victorian opera house built in the late 1800s, was located on Bouvier Avenue. It was the headquarters of the Manville Dramatic Society. This group of local actors often worked in collaboration with the Manville Brass Band to stage prize-winning operettas. These performances were held in the giant hall on the 3rd and 4th floors. Other bands performed in the hall as well. Amateur wrestling and boxing matches were held here, and there was a pool room. It was used for wedding receptions, showers, and political rallies. It also had a motion picture theater. On January 2nd, 1929, a disastrous fire destroyed this magnificent structure.
But I remember going by that hall, and the night that it burnt, the next day, going to school, we went and looked, and the building was almost crumbled at that time.
A Ukrainian church was built on the same site as the Opera House. Today, it is occupied by an electronic repair service. This 1895 Victorian building, known as the Music Hall, was once the headquarters of the famous Manville Brass Band.
There was one man who was instrumental in the creation of the music hall and the Manville Brass Band, and his name is Ephraim Mandeville. He was a mill worker, supervisor at the Manville Jenks Mill, and in the 1880s he had started to teach himself how to play brass instruments. And in time he taught himself to play virtually every brass instrument known to man, and he became very proficient at it. So good, in fact, that he he started to teach other men in the village how to play brass instruments. And by the 1880s, they had formed a village band, the Manville Brass Band. And they were a chartered organization, very well recognized. They played throughout the state, into Canada. They played operettas. They played marching, marching songs and bands and parades. And also, in the 1880s, they were meeting in different areas of the village. His dream was really to create a music hall for practice for the band members, a real headquarters. So they started raising money, and in 1895 they laid the foundation of this building, which is kind of triangular in shape, takes up a block all by itself, and was finished in 1895, and the band moved in. But basically the creation of the band and the building was entirely as a result of Ephraim Mandeville's first efforts with brass instruments.
Aldor Labine's father played a saxophone in the brass band. This gave Aldor the opportunity to lead the band in many parades.
My father's playing in the band. It did give me a job right away. And I was carrying a torch. Every time there was a parade, I had a torch. I'd carry a torch.
On December 11th, 1931, Ephraim Mandeville passed away at the age of 67.
It was a very sad time. You can understand when the founder of the band and the real driving force behind it died, the entire building was draped in black crepe. His instrument, his cornet, was carried on a black velvet pillow in a procession that left the church and all the way up to St. James Cemetery, and the band played the entire way. It was a very sad moment in time. His son had preceded him in death, so his son could not take over the band. So it ended up being his assistant band leader who did in fact do that and kept the band going through the 30s and 40s. But basically, by the time the 1950s rolled around, it was no longer the preeminent band it was at one time.